It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Richard Montgomery laughed as he poured the wine over Carla Montgomery's dress in front of the entire board. The heavy scent of a $500 Cabernet filled the air, thick and cloying, as the dark liquid soaked through her white silk blouse. It wasn't an accident. He held the crystal decanter with a steady, practiced hand, watching the crimson stain spread across her chest like a fresh wound. The boardroom fell into a suffocating silence. The only sound was the rhythmic drip-drip-drip of expensive alcohol hitting the plush mahogany table. Carla didn't move. She didn't gasp or jump back. She simply sat there, feeling the cold moisture seep into her skin, her eyes fixed on the man who had been the architect of her misery for the last 3 years. "Oh, I am terribly sorry, Carla," Richard said, though his voice lacked even a shred of sincerity. He set the decanter down with a sharp asterisk clack that echoed against the glass-walled office. "I suppose I forgot you were sitting there. You've always been so good at blending into the background, haven't you?" A few of the directors chuckled nervously. Sarah Jenkins, the CFO, looked away, her face tight with a mixture of pity and fear. But Marcus Montgomery, Carla's husband and Richard's younger brother, did the one thing that hurt more than the wine. He looked at his polished Italian leather shoes. He didn't hand her a napkin. He didn't snap at his brother. He sat in his high-backed chair, a silent, cowardly ghost of the man she thought she had married. "It's quite a mess," Richard continued, leaning back and crossing his legs. He adjusted his silk tie, the diamond on his pinky ring catching the harsh overhead lights. "But then again, your little tech project is a bit of a mess too, isn't it? Perhaps the wine will give you some color. You've been looking a bit faded lately." Carla finally looked down at the stain. It was ruined, a $300 blouse she'd saved for weeks to buy, back when she still cared about fitting into Richard's world of effortless luxury. Now, the fabric felt heavy and suffocating. She reached into her handbag, her fingers brushing against the cold, hard edges of a black encrypted thumb drive. The weight of it was grounding. Inside that small piece of plastic was a $3 million windfall Richard knew nothing about. Capital she had quietly diverted and grown through a series of shell companies he had been too arrogant to monitor. He thought she was a failing project manager. He thought she was a charity case his brother had dragged home. He had no idea she was the one holding the keys to the very proprietary code his upcoming merger depended on. "The meeting hasn't started yet, Richard," Carla said, her voice remarkably level. She reached for a linen napkin and began to dab at her chest, her movements slow and deliberate. "I believe we were waiting for the final valuation reports." Richard's eyes narrowed. He hated it when she didn't cry. He thrived on the visible collapse of others, the way people usually wilted under his calculated cruelty. "The valuation is whatever I say it is. This company is my legacy. You're just a guest in this building, Carla, don't forget that." He turned to the board, dismissing her as if she were a piece of broken furniture. "Now, as for the merger with the Sterling Group, Marcus has the projections." "Marcus." Marcus cleared his throat, his voice thin. "Yes, Richard. The numbers are looking favorable, provided the back-end integration is seamless." Carla watched her husband. He wouldn't even look her in the eye. The rage that had been a dull ember in her chest for years suddenly flared into a white-hot flame. She wasn't just losing her career or her dignity anymore. She was watching the man she loved disappear into the shadow of a bully. She stood up, the wet silk clinging uncomfortably to her ribs. The sound of her chair scraping against the floor drew every eye in the room. "I need to change," she said simply. Richard didn't even look up from his tablet. "Take your time. Or better yet, take the afternoon. We wouldn't want you smelling like a cellar during the actual negotiations." Carla walked toward the door, her heels clicking a steady, defiant rhythm against the marble floor. As she passed Sarah Jenkins, she saw the CFO's hand tremble slightly. Sarah knew. She was the only one who had seen the preliminary audits Carla had accidentally left on her desk. In the hallway, the air was cooler, smelling of floor wax and corporate ambition. Carla didn't go to the restroom. She walked straight to the elevators and pressed the button for the lobby. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but her hands were steady. She pulled her phone from her pocket and dialed a number she had memorized weeks ago. It was picked up on the second ring. "Priya," Carla said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous silk. "It's me. He just crossed the line. The board dinner is in 2 days. Is the venture capital firm ready to move?" "We've been ready for months, Carla." Priya Sharma's voice crackled through the line, sharp and hungry. "The moment you give the word, we trigger the hostile takeover. We have the shares. We have the evidence of Richard's embezzlement. All we need is the public catalyst." Carla stepped into the elevator and watched her reflection in the polished gold doors. The wine stain looked like a badge of office now, a declaration of war. "The catalyst is coming," Carla said, watching the floor numbers count down. "He thinks he bought me. He's about to find out that I'm the only thing he can't afford." She hung up just as the doors opened. The countdown had begun. 2 days until the Montgomery empire realized its foundation had already been turned to ash. Carla walked out into the bright afternoon sun, the cold wind hitting her wet shirt. She didn't feel the chill. She only felt the weight of the drive in her pocket and the absolute, terrifying certainty that by Friday, Richard Montgomery would be the one begging for a seat at the table. The next morning, the crisp air of the financial district smelled of roasted espresso and cold ambition. Carla Montgomery sat perfectly still in a corner booth of a discreet cafe, watching the sunlight glint off the polished marble tables. She felt the weight of the encrypted drive in her blazer pocket, a silent promise of the chaos to come. Across from her, Priya Sharma adjusted her glasses, her eyes fixed on a sleek tablet that displayed a complex web of shell companies and stock portfolios. "You're sure about the liquidity?" Priya asked, her voice a low, rhythmic hum that barely carried over the soft jazz playing in the background. Carla nodded, her gaze steady. "The $3 million from my father's secret trust was just the seed. I've spent months moving it through the accounts Sarah Jenkins flagged before Richard fired her. He thinks he's playing a game of status, but I've already bought the board. We have the leverage to trigger the clause." Her phone buzzed on the table. The caller ID made her jaw tighten, a reflex she was determined to kill. It was Richard Montgomery. She answered, pressing the cool glass to her ear without a word. "I hope you found a good dry cleaner, Carla," Richard's voice boomed, dripping with a condescending warmth that made her skin crawl. "I saw the security footage from the lobby. That wine stain really highlighted how out of place you looked. I've decided to officially cancel your remaining stock options. Consider it a clumsiness tax. You weren't using them for anything important anyway, right? People like you are better off with a steady paycheck and fewer delusions of grandeur." Carla didn't flinch. She caught Priya's eye and saw the ruthless spark of a shark sensing blood in the water. "I'll manage, Richard. Is there a reason you're calling, or did you just miss the sound of someone who doesn't fear you?" He let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "I'm calling because Marcus told me you were acting unstable after the board meeting. He's worried you'll try to show up at the Founders Gala on Friday. I told him not to bother. Security has your photo, and your clearance was revoked an hour ago. Stay home, Carla. Watch the live stream from your little apartment. You might actually learn how a real mogul handles a multi-billion-dollar merger." He hung up before she could respond. A second later, a text from Marcus Montgomery popped up. "Please don't make this harder, Carla. Richard is just stressed. If you apologize for the scene yesterday, I can talk him into a small severance package. Don't throw away our family's stability for your pride." Carla deleted the message, the rage in her chest hardening into a cold, crystalline resolve. She turned the tablet toward Priya. The screen showed a pie chart of Montgomery Holdings. A small, bright red sliver labeled Strategic Acquisitions had grown significantly overnight. "He thinks he's revoking my clearance," Carla said, her voice like ice. "He doesn't realize I'm the one who's about to revoke his entire legacy. How much more do we need before the meeting?" Priya tapped a finger against her chin, the rhythmic sound like a ticking clock. "With the proxies we secured this morning, we hold 14% of the voting shares. If we can get the institutional investors to flip during the gala's keynote, Richard won't just lose the merger. He'll lose the chair, his reputation, and his private equity firm. Carla stood up, smoothing her blazer. The wine-stained blouse was a memory. Now she wore navy silk that felt like armor. She reached into her bag and touched the corner of the folder containing the evidence of Richard's systematic embezzlement from the employee pension fund, proof that Sarah Jenkins had risked everything to secure. "He wants me to watch the live stream," Carla murmured, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "I think I'd rather give the shareholders something worth watching in person." 48 hours, Priya reminded her, closing the tablet with a definitive snap. 48 hours, Carla repeated. She walked out into the bright morning sun, the cold wind no longer a nuisance, but a beckoning. Richard was so busy guarding the front door that he hadn't noticed she'd already dismantled the foundation of his empire. The countdown to the gala had begun, and for the first time in her life, Carla wasn't afraid of the fall. She was looking forward to the impact. 2 days later, the air in Sarah's cramped apartment felt heavy, saturated with the smell of stale coffee and the frantic hum of a cooling fan. Sarah Jenkins sat hunched over a laptop, her face pale in the flickering blue light of the screen. She looked like a woman who hadn't slept since the day Richard Montgomery fired her, but her fingers were steady as she tapped a final key. "It's all here," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. She pushed a small, silver USB drive across the scarred wooden table. The shell companies, the offshore transfers, and the direct authorization codes Richard used to drain the employee pension fund. He didn't even try to hide it that well. He thought he was untouchable. Carla Montgomery picked up the drive. The metal was cold against her palm, a sharp, physical weight that felt like the first real weapon she'd ever held. She tucked it into the inner pocket of her blazer, right against her heart. "He isn't untouchable, Sarah. He's just loud. People confuse volume for power until the music stops." "He'll kill me if he finds out I gave this to you," Sarah said, her eyes darting to the door. "He won't have the resources to find you," Carla promised. She stood, the navy silk of her suit rustling, a sound of quiet authority that filled the small room. "By the time the gala ends, he'll be too busy looking for a lawyer who takes pro bono cases." 3 hours later, Carla stood in the glass-walled lobby of Montgomery Holdings. The scent of expensive floor wax and lilies was suffocating, a curated atmosphere of success built on a foundation of theft. She wasn't there to work. She was there to collect the last of her personal effects, a task Richard had insisted she perform in person. It was a blatant power play, a way to force her to walk the gauntlet of her former life while he watched from the balcony of his ego. The elevator chimed, a bright, synthetic sound that echoed off the marble. Richard Montgomery stepped out, flanked by Marcus Montgomery and 2 members of the board of directors. Richard looked every bit the king of the mountain, his tailored suit worth more than the average employee's annual salary. He stopped a few feet away, his presence aggressive and demanding. "Ah, the ghost returns," Richard said, his voice booming through the lobby to ensure the receptionists and security guards were listening. He didn't stop walking, forcing Carla to either move or be run down. She stood her ground. He pulled up inches from her, his expensive cologne, something musky and sharp, filling her senses. "I see you're still wearing that navy suit, trying to look the part one last time, Carla." "I'm just here for my things, Richard," she said, her voice a calm, steady contrast to his theatricality. "Your things," Richard laughed, a harsh, jagged sound that drew the eyes of everyone in the lobby. He turned to the board members, grinning with a predator's satisfaction. "She thinks there's anything in this building that belongs to her. Listen closely. You were a temporary fixture, like the furniture but significantly harder to maintain. Marcus, did you tell her the news? Or were you too busy being a loyal husband?" Marcus looked at the floor, his silence a familiar, crushing weight. He wouldn't meet Carla's eyes, his spine seemingly made of the same glass that surrounded them. "We're liquidating the remaining legacy accounts tomorrow," Richard sneered, leaning in so close she could see the arrogant flare of his nostrils. "The ones you spent 3 years building, I'm folding them into the private equity wing. By the time the gala starts, your entire department will be a memory. You're not just out of a job, you're being erased." Erasure is a dangerous game, Carla replied. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the cold edge of the USB drive. The secret power of it surged through her, a silent lightning bolt. Sometimes when you scrub too hard, you find what's hidden underneath the floorboards. Richard's eyes narrowed, a flicker of confusion crossing his face before his arrogance reasserted itself like a shield. Cryptic to the end, that's why you failed. You think life is a poem, it's a ledger, and your column is empty. He signaled to the security guard near the desk with a dismissive wave of his hand. Escort her out. She's seen enough of a world she no longer inhabits. Carla didn't wait for the guard to reach her. She turned on her heel, her movements fluid and precise. As she crossed the marble floor, she saw Priya Sharma waiting by the revolving doors. Priya didn't say a word, but the sharp, predatory glint in her eyes told Carla everything she needed to know. The capital was secured. The trap was set. The board is already questioning the liquidation move, Priya murmured as they stepped out into the biting wind of the city. Richard thinks he's consolidating power. He doesn't realize he's just putting all his sins in one basket. Let him keep building his tower, Carla said, looking up at the gleaming steel of the Montgomery building. The higher it goes, the more spectacular the impact. 48 hours, Priya reminded her, checking her watch. 48 hours, Carla agreed. She felt the weight of the drive in her pocket, the digital ghost of Richard's greed. She wasn't just the wife he'd discarded or the manager he'd mocked in front of his peers. She was the architect of the ruin he was currently celebrating, and the countdown had just hit 0. The following afternoon, the air in the Montgomery penthouse felt thick with the suffocating scent of expensive sandalwood and unearned confidence. Richard Montgomery stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his tailored charcoal suit catching the harsh light of the descending sun. He was admiring the city as if it were a private collection he'd just finished cataloging. Carla Montgomery stood near the door, her fingers brushing the cold, sleek surface of the flash drive hidden in her blazer pocket. The weight of it was a comfort, a digital detonator. She had come under the guise of collecting her final personal files, a small concession Marcus Montgomery had brokered to avoid a scene before the big announcement. "You're still here?" Richard asked without turning around. His voice carried that familiar, jagged edge of entitlement. "I thought I'd made it clear that the help should be gone by 3. The caterers need the space to set up for tomorrow's celebration." "I'm just finishing up, Richard," she said, her voice a steady, low hum. She watched him pour a finger of amber scotch into a heavy crystal tumbler. The ice clinked with a sharp, final sound. He finally turned, his gaze raking over her modest navy blazer with visible disdain. "You look tired, Carla. Poverty doesn't suit you. It makes you look gray." He walked toward her, the soles of his handmade Italian loafers silent on the plush Persian rug. "I'm feeling generous today, given that tomorrow marks the beginning of my new empire. If you leave quietly and drop the nonsense about the board, I might find a place for you in the archives. A quiet little corner where you can't break anything." Carla didn't flinch. She met his eyes, seeing the hollow vacuum of his ego. "You should be careful with the liquidation, Richard. Towers have a way of leaning when the foundation is hollow. If I were you, I'd spend tonight double-checking the compliance filings for the offshore transfers." Richard let out a short, barking laugh that didn't reach his eyes. He took a slow sip of his scotch, the smell of the peat stinging the air between them. "Advice from a project manager. That's adorable. You always did have a flair for the dramatic, but you lack the pedigree to understand how real power works. I don't check filings, I dictate them. You're out of your league, playing with shadows while I'm moving mountains." In the corner of the room, Marcus watched the exchange, his face a mask of practiced neutrality. He shifted his weight, the leather of his chair creaking in the silence. For a second, his eyes met Carla S., and she saw a flicker of something, doubt, perhaps, or a lingering ghost of the man she thought she'd married. But he said nothing. He remained the silent architect of his own cowardice. "The mountain might be heavier than you think," Carla murmured. She felt a surge of cold, sharp adrenaline. It was the wait for it moment, the quiet thrill of knowing the fuse was already burning. Just a friendly warning. Sometimes the things you discard are the only things holding the roof up. Richard's expression soured, his lip curling. Enough with the riddles, you're dismissed. Marcus, show her out, I have a legacy to finalize. He turned his back on her again, dismissed her as if she were a smudge on the glass he wanted to polish. As she walked toward the elevator, Carla's phone vibrated. It was a message from Priya Sharma. The SEC intercept is confirmed. Sarah Jenkins just signed the affidavit. The board meeting starts in 16 hours. She stepped into the elevator, the brushed steel doors sliding shut with a soft, predatory hiss. The descent felt like a countdown. She wasn't the discarded wife or the mocked employee anymore. She was the gravity that was about to bring his world down. Standing in the lobby, she watched the city lights flicker to life. The wind whipped around the corner of the building, smelling of rain and ozone. She pulled out her phone and made one final call. "Priya," Carla said, her voice cutting through the evening chill. "He didn't take the exit. He's going all in." "Good," Priya replied, her tone as sharp as a razor. "I prefer it when they don't see the blade until it's already moved." "Tomorrow morning," Carla said, looking up at the glowing penthouse where Richard was currently toasting to a future that no longer existed. "Let's make sure everyone is watching when the lights go out." She walked away from the Montgomery building, her heels clicking a rhythmic, steady beat against the pavement. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The trap was no longer being set. It was already closed. All that was left was for Richard to take his final step. The following morning, the air inside the Montgomery Plaza's grand ballroom was thick with the scent of lilies and high-stakes desperation. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls offered a panoramic view of the city, the skyline still shimmering under a gray, rain-heavy sky. It was the annual Innovation Summit, the day Richard Montgomery intended to announce a merger that would cement his legacy as the king of private equity. Carla Montgomery stood near the buffet, her fingers tracing the rim of a crystal flute. She wore a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than her former annual salary, yet she carried it with the nonchalance of someone born to the cloth. She watched the reflection in the glass. Richard was across the room, surrounded by a phalanx of investors and sycophants. He looked radiant, his teeth flashing in a practiced, predatory smile. "You're late," a voice muttered beside her. She didn't turn. She knew the scent of Marcus Montgomery's expensive, woodsy cologne anywhere. Her husband, or the man who still legally held the title, stood a step behind her, his shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. "The main event hasn't started yet, Marcus," she said, her voice a cool blade. "You shouldn't be here. Richard is in a mood. He saw the news about the mystery buyer snapping up the minority shares this morning. He's looking for someone to bleed." Carla finally turned to him. She saw the tremor in his hands, the way he looked at his brother with a mixture of worship and terror. "Then he should be careful where he swings. He might just hit a mirror." A sudden eruption of laughter drew their attention. Richard was walking toward them, flanked by two members of the board of directors. He looked Carla up and down, his lip curling in that familiar, effortless disdain. "Well, look at this," he said, loud enough to draw the attention of the nearby tables. "The charity case decided to show up. Tell me, Carla, did you have to lease that suit, or did you finally spend the last of that little $3 million windfall I let you keep?" The board members chuckled, a dry, sycophantic sound. Carla felt the heat of the rage spike in her chest, but she didn't let it reach her eyes. She remained perfectly still, a statue of patience. "I find it's better to invest in quality, Richard," she replied, "whether it's clothes or companies." He stepped into her personal space, the smell of expensive scotch and ego radiating off him. "Companies? Don't flatter yourself. You're a project manager who got lucky with a divorce settlement. You play with pennies, I play with lives. Marcus, why is she still standing here? I thought I told you to keep your dog on a shorter leash." Marcus looked at the floor, his silence a familiar betrayal. He didn't defend her. He never did. He just stood there, an enabler to his brother's rot, while the surrounding witnesses whispered behind their hands. "I'm here because I wouldn't miss this for the world," Carla said, her voice dropping to a whisper that only the three of them could hear. "You've spent your whole life looking down on people, Richard. I just wanted to be here to see what happens when the floor disappears." He laughed, a sharp, barking sound. "The only thing disappearing is your dignity. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a kingdom to run." He turned his back on her, dismissing her as if she were a piece of furniture. Carla watched him walk away, her hand sliding into her blazer pocket to touch the cold, smooth surface of her tablet. She tapped a single notification. Acquisition complete. 51% verified. Priya Sharma appeared at her elbow a moment later, her presence as sharp and focused as a laser. She held a glass of mineral water, her eyes scanning the room with predatory efficiency. "The board is seated," Priya said softly. "Sarah Jenkins is in the overflow room with the legal team. She has the original ledgers, the ones Richard thought he burned 3 years ago." "And the live stream?" Carla asked. "Ready to go. The moment he steps onto that podium, the shareholders get the alert. They won't just be watching a keynote, they'll be watching a forensic audit in real time." Carla felt a surge of cold, focused adrenaline. She looked at the glass walls. From this height, the people on the street looked like ants, tiny and insignificant. That was how Richard saw the world. He thought the glass protected him, that it made him untouchable. He didn't realize that glass was fragile. "Let's find our seats," Carla said. They moved toward the front row, passing Sarah, who sat tucked in a corner. The former CFO looked pale but determined. When her eyes met Carla's, she gave a single, microscopic nod. The evidence was secured. The weapon was loaded. Richard stepped onto the stage, the house lights dimming as a spotlight found him. He looked like a god in the glow, the Montgomery logo projected in massive, shimmering blue behind him. He gripped the edges of the lectern, leaning forward with the confidence of a man who believed the world owed him its undivided attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice booming through the hidden speakers. "They say that in business, you are either the hunter or the prey. For 20 years, Montgomery Holdings has never been the latter." Carla sat directly in his line of sight. She didn't look away. She didn't blink. Beside her, Marcus was staring at his lap, his knuckles white. "Today," Richard continued, his smirk widening as he glanced at Carla, "we finalize a merger that will erase our competition and consolidate our power. Some people thought they could challenge us. Some people thought they could play in the big leagues with pocket change." He paused for dramatic effect, the silence in the ballroom absolute. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic thrum of the building's ventilation. "But they forgot one thing," he said, his voice dropping to a growl of triumph. "I own the board. I own the bank, and I own the future." Carla leaned back, a small, terrifyingly calm smile playing on her lips. She reached into her bag and pulled out a sleek black remote. It was a simple device, meant for advancing slides, but today it held a different function. Richard took a breath to deliver his closing line, his face flushed with the euphoria of his own arrogance. He looked ready to crown himself. Carla raised the remote and pressed the center button. Behind Richard, the massive blue Montgomery logo didn't just flicker. It vanished. In its place, a spreadsheet appeared, rows upon rows of red numbers, offshore account aliases, and Sarah's digitized signature on a whistleblower affidavit. Richard didn't see it yet. He was still looking at the audience, waiting for the applause that didn't come. Instead, a low, buzzing murmur began to rise from the back of the room. Heads began to tilt. Phones began to chime in a frantic, disharmonious chorus. Richard frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Is there a technical issue?" he asked, turning around. He froze. The color didn't just leave his face. It seemed to evaporate, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked at the screen, then at the board of directors, then finally, his eyes locked onto Carla S. She stood up slowly, the movement graceful and deliberate. The room went deathly silent, the only sound the frantic clicking of cameras from the press corps at the back. "You're right about one thing, Richard," Carla said, her voice carrying through the silence without the need for a microphone. "You should have been more careful about who you let into your house." She turned and began to walk toward the exit, her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic beat against the marble floor. She didn't look back to see the security guards approaching the stage, or the way the board members were already standing up to distance themselves from the man at the podium. She reached the glass doors and pushed them open, stepping out into the hallway. Behind her, the first shouts of the fallout were beginning to rise, but she didn't stop. The trap hadn't just closed, it had shattered. The silence in the ballroom didn't just fall, it solidified, turning the air into something thick and suffocating. Richard Montgomery stood frozen at the podium, his shadow cast long and jagged against the massive projector screen behind him. The glowing display didn't show the triumphant quarterly projections he had prepared. Instead, it was a forensic autopsy of his empire. Bank statements from offshore accounts, internal memos detailing the systematic stripping of company assets, and the unmistakable digital signature of a $3 million shell company transfer glared back at the room in high-definition clarity. The hum of the projector was the only sound in the room, a low, mechanical drone that seemed to vibrate through the soles of Carla's shoes. She stood near the heavy oak doors, her hand resting lightly on the brass handle. She didn't need to shout. The data, provided by Sarah Jenkins and verified by the cold precision of Priya Sharma's legal team, was doing the screaming for her. Richard's face transformed in a terrifying, slow-motion sequence of ruin. The arrogant bronze of his tan seemed to curdle, turning a sickly, grayish-white that made him look 20 years older in a heartbeat. His eyes, usually sharp with the predatory glint of a man who owned the world, widened until the whites showed all the way around the irises, darting frantically toward the exit like a trapped animal. His jaw didn't just drop. It hung slack, his bottom lip trembling with a silent, pathetic rhythm that betrayed the sudden, violent loss of his composure. A single bead of sweat broke from his hairline, carving a glistening path through the makeup he wore for the cameras, while his chest hitched in shallow, jagged bursts that signaled the end of his reign. He looked less like a mogul and more like a ghost haunted by his own greed. Marcus Montgomery sat in the front row, his face a mask of dawning horror. He looked from the screen to his father, then back to the woman he had once called his wife. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The sleeping lion hadn't just woken up, she had already finished the hunt. Beside him, the board of directors moved as one, a synchronized withdrawal of support. They leaned away from Richard, their chairs scraping against the polished floor as they sought to distance themselves from the radioactive wreckage of his reputation. This is a fabrication," Richard finally gasped, his voice cracking, the sound thin and reedy compared to his usual booming authority. He turned toward the board, his hands shaking so violently he had to grip the edges of the podium to keep from collapsing. "Marcus, tell them, this is Carla's doing. She's bitter. She's trying to extort us." Marcus didn't speak. He couldn't even meet his father's eyes. He just stared at the floor, his silence the final, crushing betrayal of the Montgomery legacy. Priya Sharma stood up from her seat among the investors, her silk suit shimmering under the chandeliers. She held a tablet in her hand, her thumb hovering over a final command. "The SEC has already received the encrypted files, Richard, along with the signatures of every board member you tried to bribe. It's over." Carla watched him from the back of the room. She could smell the faint, metallic scent of ozone from the electronics and the heavy, floral perfume of the centerpieces, a scent that would forever be linked in her mind to the moment of her liberation. She felt a strange, cold calm. There was no need for rage anymore. The truth was a far more efficient blade. Richard lunged toward the screen as if he could tear the images down with his bare hands, but his legs gave way. He stumbled, his shoulder clipping the podium and sending the microphone crashing to the floor. The feedback shrieked through the speakers, a piercing, discordant wail that made the guests flinch. Carla stepped through the doors, the cool air of the hallway a welcome relief against the heat of the ballroom. She stopped for a single second, her silhouette framed by the light. "You told me I didn't belong in your world, Richard," she said, her voice steady and carrying easily through the stunned silence. "You were right. I don't belong in a world built on theft. That's why I decided to buy it out from under you." She didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked away, the rhythmic, confident click of her heels echoing down the corridor. Behind her, the first wave of shouts broke out, the sound of 100 people realization that the man at the front of the room was no longer a king, but a criminal. The elevator dings softly as she reached it, the doors sliding open to reveal her reflection. A woman who had lost everything only to realize she was the one who held all the cards. As the doors closed, she pulled her phone from her purse. There was one more call to make before the sun rose on the new Montgomery holdings. The elevator doors hadn't even fully closed before the sound of Richard's voice tore through the lobby, a desperate, jagged roar that lacked its usual predatory edge. He stumbled out of the ballroom, his polished leather shoes skidding on the marble floor. The crowd of investors and socialites spilled out behind him like water from a burst dam, their phones raised, capturing every second of the Titan's collapse. Richard looked like a man who had been struck by lightning while standing in a vacuum. His face was a map of sudden, catastrophic ruin. The deep, expensive tan he maintained with such vanity now looked like a sallow, muddy mask against the sickly gray pallor of his skin. His eyes, which had spent decades narrowed in condescension, were stretched wide, the whites showing all the way around the irises as they darted frantically from the elevator to the faces of the board. His mouth hung open in a jagged, silent O, and his breathing came in ragged, wet hitches that rattled in his chest. The arrogance that had served as his armor for 40 years hadn't just cracked. It had evaporated, leaving him looking fragile, aged, and utterly hollowed out. "Carla," he wheezed, his voice cracking. He reached out a hand, his fingers trembling so violently that the heavy gold signet ring on his pinky clattered against the marble wall. "You can't do this. The bylaws, the voting blocks. The bylaws were amended 3 hours ago. Richard." A voice cut in, sharp and cold as a winter frost. Sarah Jenkins stepped forward from the throng of onlookers. She wasn't the trembling, disgraced CFO he had fired 6 months ago. She stood with her shoulders squared, clutching a tablet that glowed with the final tallies of the hostile takeover. Beside her, Priya Sharma leaned against a marble pillar, her expression one of bored triumph as she adjusted a diamond cufflink. "The signatures are verified," Sarah continued, her voice carrying easily through the stunned silence of the hallway. "Every offshore account you used to hide the company's debt was traced back to your personal signature. Carla didn't just buy the shares. She bought the evidence of your embezzlement." The reaction from the witnesses was instantaneous and visceral. Marcus Montgomery, who had spent the entire evening hovering in Richard's shadow, took a visible step backward. He looked at his brother, then at the elevator where Carla stood, and finally at the floor. The shame on his face was palpable, but the instinct for self-preservation was stronger. He didn't move to help Richard. He moved to distance himself from the radioactive remains of a fallen empire. 2 members of the board of directors, men who had laughed at Richard's cruelest jokes only an hour prior, turned their backs in unison, whispering urgently into their phones. A socialite in a shimmering silk gown pulled her skirts away as Richard stumbled past, her expression shifting from admiration to pure, unfiltered disgust. The air in the lobby tasted of ozone and expensive perfume, thick with the collective realization that the power in the room had shifted permanently. Richard turned back to the elevator, his knuckles white as he gripped the brass railing. "Marcus, tell them this is a mistake." Marcus didn't even look up. "I'm sorry, Richard. The numbers don't lie. I have to think about the family name." The betrayal seemed to hit Richard harder than the financial loss. He slumped against the wall, the fine wool of his tuxedo jacket bunching awkwardly around his shoulders. He looked up at Carla, his expression a pathetic mixture of confusion and burgeoning terror. "You were a project manager," he spat, though the words had no teeth. "You were nothing. I gave you that name." Carla stood perfectly still as the elevator chime rang, a clear, crystalline sound that signaled the end of an era. She didn't shout. She didn't gloat. She simply adjusted the strap of her handbag, her eyes as calm as a frozen lake. The scent of fresh ink and cold air seemed to follow her, a stark contrast to the sweat and desperation radiating off the man at her feet. "You gave me a name, Richard," she said, her voice steady and quiet, yet it silenced every whisper in the hall. "But I'm the one who made it worth something. You spent your life building a throne out of other people's bones. You shouldn't be surprised when the structure finally collapses." She reached out and pressed the button for the ground floor. "Carla, wait!" Richard scrambled toward the doors, but a hand caught his shoulder. It was the head of security, a man Richard had personally hired and frequently belittled. The guard didn't say a word. He simply held Richard in place with a firm, immovable grip. The power inversion was complete. The man who had owned the building was now being treated like a common trespasser. "You have 30 minutes to clear your personal effects from the executive suite," Priya Sharma added, her voice dripping with mock sympathy as she checked her watch. "After that, security has orders to escort you to the curb. I hear the subway is lovely this time of year." As the elevator doors began to slide shut, Richard made one last, desperate attempt to regain his footing. He tried to draw himself up, to find that old, booming voice that had intimidated 1,000 employees. But all that came out was a thin, pathetic whimper. He watched Carla's reflection in the polished silver of the doors, a woman who was already looking past him, toward a future he was no longer a part of. The doors clicked shut, severing the connection. The last thing Carla saw was Richard sinking to his knees on the marble floor, surrounded by 100 people who were already deleting his number from their contacts. The descent was silent and smooth. When the doors opened again, the cool night air of the city rushed in to meet her. Carla stepped out onto the sidewalk, the rhythmic, confident click of her heels the only sound in the quiet evening. She pulled her phone from her pocket and saw a single message from Sarah. "It's done. The locks are being changed now." Carla looked up at the towering glass spire of Montgomery Holdings. The lights on the top floor, Richard's floor, flickered once and then went dark. She felt a strange, cold peace settle over her. The revenge hadn't been loud and it hadn't been bloody. It had been surgical. She flagged down a taxi, the yellow car pulling up to the curb with a low hum. As she climbed into the back seat, she caught her own reflection in the window. She looked the same, yet entirely different. The weight of the injustice she had carried for years was gone, replaced by the heavy, solid reality of her own power. "Where to, ma'am?" the driver asked. Carla looked at the city lights stretching out before her, a landscape of endless possibilities that no longer required anyone else's permission. "The airport," she said, her voice clear and resonant. "I have a meeting in London tomorrow morning, and I'd hate to be late for my first day as chairperson." 6 months later, the gray mist of a London morning clung to the windows of the Shard, blurring the jagged horizon of the city. Carla Montgomery sat in a high-backed leather chair that smelled of expensive hide and success, watching the steam rise from a cup of black coffee. The silence of the executive suite was absolute, a stark contrast to the chaotic roar of the New York trading floor she had left behind. She felt the cool, heavy weight of a platinum fountain pen in her hand, a gift to herself that cost more than her first car. It was a tool for building, not for defense, and the realization brought a quiet, steady peace to her chest. A soft chime echoed through the room as the private elevator opened. Priya Sharma stepped out, her heels clicking a rhythmic, confident beat against the polished marble. She dropped a thick dossier onto the mahogany desk, a sharp smile playing on her lips. "The final audits are in. The Montgomery Holdings transition is complete. We've successfully rebranded the European division as Mercer Sharma Global. Richard's name has been stripped from every lobby, every letterhead, and every digital footprint from here to Singapore." Carla didn't gloat. She simply nodded, her gaze drifting back to the window. "And the New York litigation." "It's a bloodbath," her ally replied, leaning against the edge of the desk. "Sarah Jenkins spent 3 hours on the stand yesterday. She brought the receipts, literally. The forensic evidence of the offshore accounts Richard used to hide the pension deficits was undeniable. The judge didn't just freeze his personal assets. He issued a discovery order for the last 10 years of his tax returns. He's finished, Carla. He's spent the last of his liquid cash on a legal team that's already preparing him for the reality of a minimum security facility. The image of her former tormentor flickered in her mind. She thought of him not as the titan who had poured wine over her dress, but as the man she had seen on the news feed that morning. Richard Montgomery had been caught by a paparazzo outside a mid-tier legal aid office. He looked smaller, his expensive silk suit hanging off a frame that had lost its blustering posture. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow, frantic look in his eyes, the look of a man who finally realized that his name carried no weight when the bank balance hit zero. He was no longer a lion. He was a ghost haunting the ruins of his own ego. He tried to call the office again this morning, Priya added, her voice softening. He wanted to negotiate a consultant role for the legacy transition. He still thinks he has something to offer. Tell security to update the block list, she said, her voice like level ice. He has nothing I want. As the other woman left to finalize the morning's acquisitions, Carla's phone vibrated on the desk. The screen lit up with a name that still caused a faint, dull ache in her throat, Marcus Montgomery. She stared at the name for a long moment. It was the 4th time he had called this week. In the aftermath of the takeover, her husband had tried to play the role of the repentant spouse, claiming he had only stayed silent to protect her from his brother's wrath. But she knew the truth. He hadn't stayed silent to protect her. He had stayed silent because he was afraid of losing the lifestyle Richard provided. Now that the money was gone and the prestige had curdled into scandal, he was reaching out to the only person left with power. She didn't answer. She didn't even feel the urge to press the decline button. She simply watched the screen go dark, the silence returning to the room. This was the cost of the surgical strike she had performed. She had saved the company, she had secured her future, and she had delivered a proportional justice that Richard would feel for the rest of his life. But in the process, she had burned the bridges that led back to the woman she used to be. The innocence that allowed her to believe in family first had been a casualty of the war. She stood up and walked to the door of the boardroom. Inside, the long table was set for the morning's directors' meeting. At the very end sat a single, empty chair, the one Richard used to occupy with such suffocating gravity. She walked past it without a second glance, taking her place at the head of the table. The chair was cold, the room was quiet, and the crown was heavy. She had won everything she set out to take, but as she looked at the empty seat where her family used to be, she realized that the most powerful person in the room was often the one with the most to lose. She picked up her pen, the ink wet and black on the first page of a new era. The revenge was over. Now, the real work began.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.